Hi, this is Alicia with Performentor, and this is another Heuristic podcast. And today we're going to talk to Amy Rawls. Amy is an executive HR consultant with Performentor. She's on the team, and she also has her own consulting firm. It's called ASR Business Partnering, LLC. Now, Amy and I have been working together on and off for many, many years. I hold her in very high esteem. She's very, very smart. She won't tell you that. And has lots of amazing and interesting ideas. So that's why we're talking today. Amy, anything you'd like to add?
No, it's just been such an honor to continue to work with you. And I feel like we have had such incredible opportunities to learn and grow together, and just appreciate the opportunity to talk today.
Cool. Awesome. Well, the heuristic that we're going to talk about today is sometimes there's one right way, probably not this time. And just like, and this is sort of like an iteration on where there's some people that are always about the best practice, and sometimes there are best practices, but sometimes a complete focus on best practices means that we don't come up with new practices that might be better or might be better for this situation. So to me, that's a reminder that every situation is a little different, and there's not one right way to do everything. So that's where that came from. I was just curious what your initial reaction is to that heuristic.
Yeah, my reaction is it's my favorite one. And it's because I think it really describes the importance of remaining flexible, open to new information, and recognizing that, like you say, there's very few circumstances where there's only one potential direction to move in and one solution that fits every single time. So I think, as consultants and as professionals, just being able to remain curious about better ways of doing things or alternative ways of doing things. Even if we do go back to that best practice, exploring the other possibilities helps us to arrive at what will work best given these current conditions and the constraints we're facing in the moment, which will change over time.
Yeah. Maybe we could reflect back on when we worked together previously, sort of on the corporate side, and I would say that knowing what I knew then, that was a great opportunity, because I was coming in and I was working with a team of very, very smart people, but I was really the only person with any human resources background or not at all. So I thought, well, what a great opportunity to try and experiment with things that I probably couldn't get away with doing in more established organizations with more established HR functions. I guess what is your take, and what was your read on that, and how, when you were in the HR leadership role, I guess what sorts of ways did you, apply this heuristic?
Yeah. So I think most tangibly, my philosophy about creating policy and rules came out of this line of thinking, which is policies and rules can provide great guidance, and they can also really box you into this kind of thinking, which is there's only one way to do this. And so one of the things that I took away from my corporate experience in HR leadership was that there are times when policies are required, but a lot of times we can apply really solid judgment and take things more case by case, and allow us to apply our creativity and our problem solving skills without being boxed in. And so it's actually one of the things that when I really sat down to think about where can I add the most value and where do I get my tank filled as well, as really working within organizations that are smaller and a little more flexible in that area, so that we can really think about, what is best in this specific situation. And so that's one kind of example of how I applied the thinking, not only to the organization I was in, but in the context of my own career.
So in terms of policies, being mindful that not just one way of having, there's not one right policy for any particular thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I see performance feedback being an arena where this heuristic really comes up, because I've seen it done so many different ways, including the very informal way. Some people say there is no process, but I guarantee there's a process everywhere, but it just may not be a very consistent one, nor documented. But what kinds of different ways have you experimented with performance feedback?
Yeah, so I think, to your point, everything we do as leaders is providing feedback, right? So even not actively providing feedback is a way of communicating something. So we go from the very passive to the very formal and structured. I think that the way this applies in the context of performance feedback is really being aware of how true it is that everyone is an individual and we're all humans, and that if you are, in charge of a team, for example, you're the lead of a team, that being mindful and asking questions about how people like to receive feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, being aware that what works for one person on your team may not work for every person on your team. And while we do want to have some consistency, we also want to make room for what's going to work, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is provide feedback in a format that allows the person to understand how their performance, is being perceived by manager and others, and also give them the tools to evaluate their performance in real time on their own. So getting that right for each person is the most important thing. The format is maybe a little less important in my perspective, but also just reminding leaders, just if you don't know the answer to that question for anyone on your team, like how do they need their feedback, ask them, they'll tell you. And then you'll be able to deliver exactly what they need. So that's a really great example of there's no one right way to deliver performance feedback, because you're ultimately working with human beings that will have different preferences.
That's a very almost controversial approach, though, because mostly you talk to HR people, and especially performance feedback is all about consistency. And what I learned is that consistency is important for some things, but consistency, to your point, when it comes to what is the right way to deliver feedback and share feedback with this individual, is not the same in terms of, is this person getting what they need in order to be successful? But so consistency actually can cause problems for that purpose, so it's like there's two different purposes. Like we need some consistency across the system so that we can make reasonable comparisons and see trends in terms of how the team's doing, and know how to distribute compensation changes, etc. But in the nuts and the bolts and in the actual conversations, consistency doesn't necessarily that's not necessarily a good way to go. I don't think.
And I think one approach that can be holding consistent, like the bare minimal requirements of your feedback system. So it has to happen at least quarterly. It has to be documented this way. Occasionally you're going to have to make some ratings, right? And that can be consistent. And like you said, what you have control over is the conversation you have, the narrative, the exact format, or additional things you're doing to communicate to each team member in a way that resonates for them.
Yeah, I remember at some point, I don't know if it's still in practice, probably isn't, that I think we did create a form, but it was like bare minimum. And then we had all these talking points and guidelines about all the different ways, right, that they could highlight, or I think it was like we would say, you can do any, all, or none, or some of these, if I remember correctly.
Agreed. And again, it was about having that the structure to allow consistency with room to apply judgment or personalization, so that, again, each team member is receiving information in a way they process well, and that helps them understand where they sit today with their performance, where they want to go, and how to get there.
Yeah. So I guess this is the whole idea that if there's one right way, if you're dealing with humans, and humans are all different, maybe that's where that kind of starts to fall apart.
And as a scientist, I can tell you there are certainly things in the world, there is one right way to do things, right? You don't start free forming it in the middle of a scientific protocol. You follow it step by step by step, and you don't say, oh, it said 30 grams, but I'm going to see what happens if I put 37 grams. Like, you don't do that. But that's because you're not dealing with human beings usually. And so I think, when dealing with the world we're in, with, the people side of the business, your heuristic is exactly true. It's just, maybe there is one right way to do something, but it's probably not this time. And that's why I love it. It's just the way it's framed.
I I can imagine these lab workers, like a jazz musician, kind of like free forming, kind of like, we're going to measure it this way at this time. We're going to kind of like how my husband cooks, kind of like, wow, that came out really, really good. Can you replicate it? No.
Right. Having said that, some of our most important scientific discoveries came from someone making an error, right? So, or the experiment didn't work, right? I mean, that is how science often does work. So, hey, maybe there's some application for it. It's just not the expected or predictable outcome.
If there's one right way, then why would an error be helpful?
Right. That's for another session.
That's kind of interesting. Yeah. Or we're going to measure things differently now. What counts as this readings, right? Yeah. What are some other, can you think of any other examples of how this one right way, probably not this time, has come up maybe more recently for you?
Put me on the spot.
Yeah.
Let me think about that one. I think it can often be true in terms of like titles and organizational structure. So when you zoom out, a lot of times I've seen kind of resistance to a title where it's, oh, that doesn't exist so commonly in the world, but yet it's descriptive. It's exactly what we're talking about. And there can be some, kind of tension between, it's not very common, it's not seen all the time, but it feels right on. So that's one example where I've had, really healthy debate with business leaders about, what's the most important priority? That it's recognizable when the person goes external facing out in the world in your industry, or that it's super descriptive what they do, because, we might arrive at a different final outcome depending on what the top priority is. So a lot of times when there are multiple options, I found just stepping back and saying, what's the most important thing we need to accomplish, is a good way to drive you to kind of like, what's the right answer in the moment. And again, that condition can change over time. So being open not only to what is the right option today, but knowing that you may revisit it later, and that's okay. So that's not a really complex example, but certainly one I've been in multiple times recently that I can relate this principle to, of just, how do we decide between competing options when there's not one right way, is step back and look at your priorities and what are you actually trying to accomplish. And if there's multiple of those things, what's the most important one?
Yeah, and just, I guess socialize it, get feedback on it,
Exactly.
hear from the people skin in the game to look at another heuristic. Or as you described that, I was thinking of a conversation I had one of other team members this morning about playing around with the job title on a job posting. So, and she was like, I don't know, the client's getting a little worried. And she was like, no, we're not saying that they would use this title internally, but we want to see what happens in terms of attracting people that we might not have caught their eye before. We can still use whatever title we want to use internally. And I think one nice thing about this, sometimes there's one right way, and it's hard to do this with policies and certain things, but it encourages experimentation. Like, let's try it and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. Or if it does work, we'll like, wow, we've discovered something that worked here that we wouldn't have guessed. So like, and I've heard the same kind of thing before in recruiting. There's just a lot of experimentation that needs to happen. A/B testing, to use kind of the marketing terminology. So.
Especially these days. When you're not getting the expected outcome from a specific approach, right, being willing to try another one and revisit over time is really a main driver of scaling businesses that are successful in their growth. I think it's just a commitment to try and try again.
Yeah. Another thing that I was rattling around in my head when I wrote this heuristic is that our human brains, once we've locked onto an explanation for something or a right way to do something, we've locked in. I already said the word. We locked in, and we're not as open to revisiting our assumptions about that. Just maybe it worked just adequately in the past, and better to stick with the devil you know versus the one, the scary unknown that you don't. And so I just like this as a reminder that if you think there's one right way, you're probably wrong, which is not comfortable.
Right. No, we don't like ambiguity. We're not wired for ambiguity. So like you said, once you've kind of eliminated some ambiguity, the last thing you want to do is, like, in your human nature, is to go back and introduce ambiguity again. But sometimes it is the right thing to do.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah, this kind of links a little bit to another interview podcast that we were talking about, a completely different heuristic, but person was talking about, rather than focusing on the things that you know in a situation, actually taking the time to list out the things that you don't know, and for the things that you think you know, actually writing down what your, I guess, level of confidence is that it's true, right? Like, there's a big difference between, I know this to be true, but I'm really only 65% confident that it's true in this case, versus
Right.
I am 100%, and so I think that I think that interacts nicely with this one, and that there's this practice of, like, well, what is it that we don't know about this situation? What assumptions are we making that might end up being false? And that's hard to do. So.
Yeah, it is.
All right. Any questions, or when have you seen it go wrong to use a best practice because it's a best practice?
Yeah. Well, I think I don't want to, like, shine a light too specifically on this particular example, but I think the example I'm thinking of is when sticking to something just because we've always done it that way just does two things. First, it kills innovation, and maybe not even the most grand version of innovation. It might just be someone saw an inefficiency and knew how to fix it, but bottled that up, right? So that leads to the second part, which is it is demoralizing to the team if they're working within the context of there's only one right way to do something. We figure it all out. Just, like, kind of take your marching orders and go. Because we all have ideas that we'd love to share, and sometimes having that mentality of this is the way we do it can create, at a minimum, a lack of creativity and innovation, and a maximum fear for bringing new ideas forward. And especially in that latter case, people will not stick around. So I think that's kind of what comes to mind for me, is if you get too locked into one specific way of doing something, it has bigger consequences than just doing it that way. There is impacts on the team.
Yeah, I know that. I'll share an example, and then we can, orient to wrapping up. But I've gotten feedback through the years. I guess no one would give that to me these days, but in the past, I've gotten feedback that, I was resistant to changing things. And I think what I remember that being was, sometimes you take a practice, and maybe at first it was very innovative, it was definitely out of the box, and then it's not just a thing that's separate, it's all interacted within, like, a dozen other things that are also kind of interwoven into it. And what looks like a small change that you could experiment with is in reality something that require a very, very heavy lift to actually change. And so that can be something that's a little bit anxiety producing, or you wonder, is, like, have an unknown benefit from making a change. So I think the key is like, are there ways, or can we build our systems so that it is easier to experiment without feeling like we're taking the whole ship apart just to see if we can, I don't know, replace the steering wheel. I don't, that's a terrible analogy.
I like it. That's great.
Anything else that you would like to share or hoped to get across, or before we wrap up?
I think, I'll just reiterate that I think the way to put this in practice routinely and almost without effort is to remain open and curious and listen to what you are presented with like as much of an open mind as possible. And then you'll realize that in almost every scenario, there are multiple alternatives to consider. And so just being willing to do that at every opportunity will get you where you need to go.
Keeping an open mind.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, Amy, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
All right.